Hi, Yael Cassandra, Communications Director for the City of Bloomington, and I'm happy to be here today with John Fernandez, Bloomington's mayor from 1996 to 2003. Hi, John.
Hello, thanks for having me.
I'm going to add a little of your bona fides here. You're currently the Global Chief Innovation Officer for the Denton Law Firm in Washington, D.C. And previously, you served as President Barack Obama's Assistant Secretary of Commerce for Economic Development. That's a mouthful. Did I get that right?
You got it right. It is a mouthful.
All right. Well, let's go back to, we're talking about annexation today, and I'm glad to have you here to give us a little perspective. Let's begin with your time as Bloomington's mayor. Again, that was 96 to 2003. And of course, Bloomington had already experienced hundreds of annexations before your time, since its founding in 1818. You oversaw several annexations during your two administrations.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe you can describe those efforts and why you undertook them. Why were they necessary?
Yeah.
And how did they benefit Bloomington?
Yeah, and I think it's a great place to start. And I would just provide just a tiny bit more context. I mean, that was a while ago, sometimes longer than I like to admit. And it was a different context. I mean, back then, there was much more clarity around the role of city, municipal government, and government services, and more the traditional kind of county delivered services in our county, in our city. And back then, you still had a thing called the 2 mile fringe, which was a statutory setting that cities, municipalities would control planning and zoning for properties within the 2 mile fringe outside of the corporate limits, unless the county had a comparable comprehensive plan, something that would be similar in terms of quality and I guess comprehensiveness of the city's plan. So, in the context of the 2 mile fringe, there was always some tension. So we worked with the county commissioners to draw what we believed to be reasonable areas intended for annexation, areas that were within that 2 mile fringe, but we thought reasonably would evolve into the next edges of Bloomington's boundaries because of the proximity, because of the the potential for development. Whereas some of those areas in the 2 mile fringe, were far enough out that were just incredibly hilly or other kinds of geographically challenged places where you clearly weren't going to be able to run like wastewater or water lines. So we created this agreement to guide our planning, to guide our growth that we all agreed to. And that's important for a lot of reasons. One is predictability for a municipality in terms of planning and budgeting. It's predictability for the business community, for other kinds of residents who know that this is the plan. And it just makes a lot of sense. Now, our plan, though, was really based heavily on the updated growth policies plans, which really emphasize compact urban form. We were trying to fight sprawl. And so we came up with a plan that would encourage people to move into the city, have higher density within the city, make it easier to deliver services, but create that kind of energy that represents what cities typically have. Now, that's a lot of context, but I think it's important context because simultaneously, along with the planning, we also made plans for where we're going to extend wastewater and water infrastructure. And we created zones where if you were within those zones, and those typically were in the areas intended for annexation, you would be able to count on the extension of sewers. If you were in the zones outside of the AFA, then it became much more complicated. And as part of that, that's where the waivers for annexation came in. The infrastructure plan that included the extension of utilities, which included the waivers to remonstrate. That was a deal. That was like a contract we have. And that's what I find so frustrating about the intervention of the Indiana, legislature and some of the county officials and others who now feel like those agreements have no value. They were contracts. They were part of, in the context I was trying to provide, shows how all this was part of a larger agreement. It was a common vision that people bought into, that we would grow this way. And it gave that kind of predictability that could help us with economic development activity to attract more, investment and economic opportunities for our people. But it was part of a plan. And
so, given that 2 Mile Fringe and the areas that were intended for annexation, how many of those annexations, or how much of that territory, did actually get annexed during your terms?
I couldn't give you a specific amount. I mean, because it was intended. So back then, the way the law was too is that you would want if it was undeveloped land, it was intended for annexation. You did the planning and zoning, you extended the infrastructure, and then you waited to do the annexation until the new facility or development was completed, and then that would kind of get absorbed into the city's property tax base, and that would give you the ability to capture that without it, having a negative impact because of the way levies are set. But we did, if I recall, I think we systematically did annexation on a fairly regular basis. And again, it wasn't very controversial because it was part of the plan and everybody agreed to it. I think the problem the city has today is that you had this massive just time go by where nothing happened. And the AFA was not reinstated. And then nothing happened on an annexation front. So more time passes between when people made these agreements, not to remonstrate. In some cases, you have maybe the second generation of owners of the properties, and they're like, well, I don't remember that. And it just, those delays have caused, obviously, a massive amount of problems.
So, John, let's go back to that time, 96 to 2003. It was really a very transitional period for Bloomington. I remember very well. I came here during that time, and there was this huge shift from the heavy manufacturing to more of the high tech and life sciences stuff that really distinguishes us and our economy now. So, why do you played an important role in that, in launching the Bloomington Life Sciences Partnership with partners? So how did annexation fit into that? How would you say that growing our city's borders was key to putting us on the map in life sciences?
Well, a couple things. One, it was a big transition. Not just Thompson RCA, but with Westinghouse, ABB. People, it's amazing how many jobs we used to have that provided really solid middle class, upper middle class, wages. Those are all gone. And we have to be focused on how do we, create replacement? How do we go forward in a way that creates opportunity? And I think part of the challenge we have in Bloomington, and annexation is part of the solution here, if you will, is scale. When we talk about a lot of the 21st century kind of knowledge based industries, some of the more technology driven jobs, investments, research development, these are all kinds of the innovation economy and jobs and employers that are really going to fuel the future. And that really means creating quality job opportunities, career opportunities for our people. And you got to have scale, is the point. And Bloomington, is not a very large community. And that's why I think a lot of people support things like higher density development in the urban area. But at the end of the day, we do have this kind of tale of two cities, where on the one hand, we want to be this highly urbanized cosmopolitan environment where you can get good economic opportunities, great cultural amenities, fantastic downtown with all the amenities and great restaurants and et cetera, et cetera. But on the other hand, we don't want the scale. We want the economic opportunities. We want to attract, great high-paying jobs, but we don't want to have scale. And I think that fundamentally that is an identity crisis that holds the community from going back. So if we take that into the context of annexation, if you look at these areas around the edges of the city, particularly along the highway, those are opportunities for some pretty good, business development opportunities, economic development activities. You think about, some of the kinds of higher density employment centers that could be really meaningful, but you got to have scale. And so having some of these additional areas that are functionally, part of the city, become part of the city, that's going to give us more population. That population is going to create more of a sense of this is a good place to be, a safe place to be. If I'm thinking about relocating or bringing a business here, that I'm going to have the depth of talent I need to be able to successfully grow my business. And that's, I think that's been a real challenge for Bloomington, is that we're just small. And, we're probably bigger than we seem. But by having these areas that should be in the city, outside of the city, it just, holds us back from.
Would you say that there are any benchmark communities whose growth through annexation might serve as a model for Bloomington, or perhaps some that did not annex and that might serve as a cautionary tale?
Unfortunately, I think there's more stories on the cautionary tales of what can go wrong than success. Now, I grew up in Kokomo, Indiana, and they did annexation, and we lived in the effectively the 2 mile fringe. We wanted to be in the city, and a big part of that was we wanted to be able to vote. We're a quarter mile away from the boundary. Everything that the city did from a governance perspective affected our lives. We worked in the city, went to school in the city. All of the commercial activity was in the city, and we had zero voice. So we always wanted that. And frankly, we wanted to be on the utilities, because where I grew up, we were on septic. So I think not enough is said about that, but I do think one of the important parts of annexation is, first, it is about having this kind of shared vision of what our community looks like, but then also having shared voices in it and being able to build a shared community that's engaged. We're engaged in contributing fairly to the cost of this environment that we all love, and not just sitting on the edge and frankly being a free rider, which a lot of these folks are. And I know that sounds harsh, but it's true. And then being able to vote and have a say in what's going on in our community. But that's all about being part of a community. But in these areas adjacent to the city that were developed intentionally as more urbanized areas, it totally makes sense to bring them formally into the city, make them part of our community, enable them to be part of the community in its fullest extent, and contribute, not just economically, but in terms of the, civic leadership and everything else that we need from our citizens. And so I think that, when we come back to these areas intended for annexation, I think every one of the properties that's in the current proposal were, I think every one of those were in the areas intended for annexation. This is just dusting off an old plan that was really well constructed based on a number of factors, including sound environmental planning, working on the concept of smart growth, creating these kinds of communities where it would make sense for you to be able to have efficient services, but be part of something as a citizen, as part of a community. These weren't random acts of annexation. These were all part of a well designed, comprehensive plan built together with the city, its citizens, and the county and county government. They were all part of that. There was no dispute. What's happened, though, is that with this long delay of action around the areas intended for annexation, we now are in this place where instead of having the incremental annexations that happen as developments would occur, which was the normal way things would happen. The Hamilton administration is stuck with having to try and catch up for a lot of years of inactivity, and that's made it a much bigger challenge, from a political perspective and community perspective.